Hi everybody, this is Professor John Gillespie, and this is my video lecture on Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and the War of 1812. We're going to be looking at the presidencies of these two men, how they interacted with foreign affairs and domestic affairs, and how these events eventually culminated in the War of 1812 with Great Britain, which some people call America's Second War for Independence. So let's get going. So in past lectures, we have looked at Thomas Jefferson in quite a bit of detail, and I think it's now time that we formally meet the man and put it all together, since he is going to be the president for 2 terms starting in the year 1800. Well, we know that Thomas Jefferson was a leading statesman and intellectual from the state and formerly the colony of Virginia. He was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which means he was a legislator for that state. He was a member of the First and the Second Continental Congress during the Revolutionary period. He authored the Declaration of Independence, which was the document that on which the revolutionaries drew as the philosophical foundation for their break from Great Britain. He was also the author of many other things, including the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedoms, which became one of the foundational philosophical pieces on which we based our First Amendment, which guarantees all Americans the freedom of religion. He was also the Secretary of State under President Washington. He was the ambassador to France and helped to write France's Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which was their Declaration of Independence, so to speak, in 1789. Also, back at home, Thomas Jefferson is the leader of Republican or Democratic Republican opposition to the Federalist Party. He was strongly opposed to the policies of Alexander Hamilton and even those of George Washington, namely the Whiskey Rebellion, in which Washington invaded, as he saw it, the sovereign state of Pennsylvania to make them pay their excise taxes. All of these angered Thomas Jefferson quite a bit. He was a supporter, tacitly anyway, of Shays' Rebellion, refusing to condemn the Shayites for their rising up against the moneyed power in Boston, as he saw it. And he was the author of the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, which presented the compact theory of government, or one of the strongest articulations of the states' rights theory, drawing on the 10th Amendment of the Bill of Rights, which stated that the states are the final arbiter of matters of constitutionality. And now we're going to look at Thomas Jefferson as the President of the United States, elected in the year 1800. Now, when Thomas Jefferson is elected, the Federalists and those within the Federalist Party are worried. And this is because this is the first transfer of power that the young republic has yet seen. And ordinarily, the history of Europe has shown us that the losing party doesn't always accept their loss non-violently. So the Federalists are worried. Who's going to go to jail? Who's going to be locked up? Who's going to be silenced, or worse? Now, they have reason to be worried, because if you recall, President John Adams and the Federalist Congress had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts back in 1798, resulting in the imprisonment of up to 20 Democratic Republicans for simply criticizing the current president. So, are we going to see a taste of our own medicine now, says the Federalists? Well, Jefferson assures everybody as he takes the podium at his inauguration in 1800, we are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. And there's a part I really want to underscore here. Let them stand undisturbed. He's talking about the Federalists. I'm not going to go after you, he says. I'm not going to lock you up for holding a difference of opinion. I'm not going to send you to jail for criticizing me. Because as long as reason is left free and unfettered to combat error, liberty will reign. And so Jefferson calls his election the Revolution of 1800. A couple of reasons for that. One is because this is, as we've said, the first peaceful transfer of power in American history. And the second is, nobody died. Nobody went to jail. Blood did not run in the streets. This shows us that our Republican process works. We had an election. We had a loser and we had a winner. And it's now an American tradition that the loser accept the results and work with the winner to ensure the continued tranquility of the nation. Well, Jefferson, at the same time he says he's not going to lock up those Federalists, he really didn't care for a lot of the things they did while in office. So he wants to symbolically dress down the presidency. And in doing that, he walked to his inauguration. George Washington rode a white horse and had rose petals thrown at his feet. Jefferson's going to walk on a dirt path. Jefferson's going to say, I don't need to be called Your Excellency, Your Highness, or any of these other elevated terms that people tossed around during his age. He's going to say, look, just call me Mr. President. Jefferson was known to personally answer the door to the White House if some ordinary citizen walked in and wanted to have a word with the man. And he was known to shake hands with ordinary people. And yeah, that seems weird to us because politicians today are always pressing the flesh, always shaking hands. But to lower himself, so to speak, to shake hands with the average citizen, this in itself was a revolutionary gesture. Jefferson had a really romantic view of ordinary people, especially farmers and those who work with their hands. He wrote, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." Well, Jefferson says that his election, which he called the election or the Revolution of 1800, was in fact a mandate to return to earlier Republican principles. You see, he says that the Federalist Party took the country too far to the right, and he wants to go more toward the Republican direction. He says the Revolution of 1800 was as real a revolution in the principles of our government as that of 1776 was in its form. Not affected indeed by the sword as that, but as the rational and peaceable instrument of reform, the suffrage, or that is the voting power of the people. So Jefferson's vision, first and foremost, is to downscale the government, which he believes the Federalists had elevated. He wants to adhere to strict constructionism, which means if it's written in the Constitution, we follow it. If not, we can't do it. Nothing to be inferred, nothing to be implied. He also wants to reduce the size of the military because he believes that standing armies and standing navies are a threat to the people and a threat to domestic tranquility. His other goal is to establish what he calls an empire of liberty. That is, he looks to the west beyond the Appalachian Mountains, and he wants to populate it with good salt-of-the-earth Americans, with Republican farmers, the sort of folks he likes so much. And you can see one of the emblems that came about. This is from 1747, but it was a popular symbol in Jefferson's day too, in his presidency. It says, "Venerate the plow." And there you see a farmer. And which direction is he heading? He's heading westward. And following behind him is the angel or the symbol of liberty, which you can see by the stars surrounding her head. So as that farmer moves westward, he takes liberty with him. And that's sort of the thinking that animates a lot of Thomas Jefferson's beliefs. Well, the first challenge to the Jeffersonian agenda comes in 1803 when a guy named William Marbury decides to sue the federal government. What for? So that's William Marbury. Now, William Marbury was a midnight judge. Now, what that means is that on the night before he had to leave office, President John Adams, a Federalist, was appointing federal judges as fast as he could. Over a dozen of these guys he appoints, signs their commissions, and says, we're going to give you guys a seat. Now, this means that he is trying to stack the court with Federalists who can hopefully block a bunch of anti-Federalist or Republican legislation and protect some of the things that he wants to protect. Well, Jefferson and Madison, his Secretary of State, they know this. And so Madison decides he's just going to sit on the appointment. He doesn't sign the papers, sort of keeps it in a drawer. Well, Marbury doesn't like this. So by the time 1803 rolls around, he decides he's going to sue. He's suing for his appointment. I want to be a judge. In other words, I've been hired. Now give me my gavel, show me the bench, and tell me when I start. So the question before the Supreme Court: does Madison have to seat Marbury? The Chief Justice at this time is a man named John Marshall. John Marshall's answer is no. He doesn't have to seat William Marbury. Why not? Well, he says this is why. A portion of the Judiciary Act of 1789, which was signed under the administration of George Washington, is unconstitutional. Now, wait a minute. We must pause. What do we mean? Now, this means that the court has the power to review acts of Congress. Let me say that again. He ruled that a portion of the Judiciary Act in 1789 is unconstitutional. This is a legal precedent because at no other time in the history of the court, which is not that old, by the way, has a justice ruled that something passed by Congress has been unconstitutional. And in doing so, he sets a major legal precedent. So on the one hand, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison won this lawsuit. They do not have to seat William Marbury. But in doing this, John Marshall has set a precedent for the court. So we call him the Great Chief Justice, and he's not going to leave American history until the age of Jackson. He established in this Supreme Court case, Marbury v. Madison, the principle of judicial review. This is the foundation of the court's powers. It means that the Supreme Court has the final say when it comes to ruling on the constitutionality of every other branch of government, the executive and the legislative. They do something, people question it, it goes to the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court's decision to say, yes, this is constitutional, no, this is not constitutional. So Jefferson's compact theory of government, in which the states have come together to form the Union, and the states should retain the ultimate interpretive power over the Constitution, that is wiped away by this Marbury ruling. And Thomas Jefferson is not too happy. He says John Marshall's twistifications in the case of Marbury shows how dexterous he can reconcile law to his personal biases. Should also mention that John Marshall is a distant cousin of Thomas Jefferson, both of them being Virginians and part of the same family tree, but they certainly did not agree with each other when it came to the interpretation of the Constitution. So the second goal of Thomas Jefferson during his presidency was to scale down the military. They are threats to liberty. Who remembers the Whiskey Rebellion and when that Federalist George Washington invaded a sovereign state to make them pay their taxes? And so Jefferson halts the construction of the Navy that John Adams had begun to construct. He drops the fighting force of the United States down to 2,500 men. So basically the size of a mid-sized police department. And then a challenge. The Barbary pirates take American prisoners in the Mediterranean Sea, and they demand tribute, or a bribe. What is Jefferson supposed to do? Well, Jefferson is going to refuse to pay any bribe to a foreign power. Now, Adams had always very quietly paid about the bribe of $25,000 a year. And what the Barbary pirates are doing is they're testing out the new president to see if he's going to play along or if he's going to be a problem. And Jefferson says, I'm going to be a problem. Jefferson says, nope, not going to pay it. And so the Pasha of Tripoli declares war on the United States. He does so symbolically by going outside to the flag at the U.S. consulate, which we had, and he chops it down. And then he seizes the American ships in the area and takes hostages. What are we going to do? France and England are watching. This is one of our first great diplomatic crises with a non-European nation. If we prove to be weak in this instance, we'll be picked on by every other major and not major power on the globe. Everybody is watching. What are you going to do, Thomas Jefferson? How is Thomas Jefferson going to handle this? Is he going to raise an army and go to war? This isn't within his Republican principles. Raising an army, that's a bad idea, according to Democratic Republicans. And that means raising taxes, increasing the size of the federal government. No. Should we pay the bribe demanded by the pirates? Well, that's going to be politically unwise too. And we all remember what John Marshall had said when he went over and talked with X, Y, and Z during the Napoleonic Wars. Millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Jefferson has to live up to that statement if he's going to prove himself to be a worthy president. So what's the solution? His solution is to raise a tiny little navy, which he calls the Mosquito Fleet, or the Jeffs, as they're nicknamed. These are tiny little ships, small gunboats with just one gun. They're cost effective, which means no new taxes, and they're not too intimidating, so no one is really worried that Thomas Jefferson is going to turn these on the citizens and become like George Washington in the Whiskey Rebellion. Well, it is a success. Thomas Jefferson and the United States' first foreign adventure overseas, invading the shores of Tripoli and freeing the American hostages. Thomas Jefferson is able to do all of these things with his small gunboat fleet and rescue the hostages, and now American merchants are free to navigate the Mediterranean with, let us say, a discounted rate. Well, the United States continues to grow up and to grow out as pioneers move westward. The population in 1780 is just 2,780,400. By 1800, we have blossomed to 5,308,483. Now, 4 new states have gone up since 1791. Jefferson has always believed that the whole of the American continent was destined to be part of the United States. This he calls his Empire of Liberty. The problem is that this is still Spanish territory. Well, the U.S. had a foothold along the Mississippi River. Thanks to Pinckney's Treaty, which was ratified by the Senate in 1795, the U.S. was allowed to navigate the Mississippi River and the Port of New Orleans duty-free, means the United States does not have to pay taxes. But in 1800, Spain makes a surprise move, selling Louisiana back to France, and, well, Napoleon says that the river is now off limits to the United States, closing off the U.S. from the lucrative trade that we used to enjoy. But then a slave revolution breaks out in Haiti that's actually the beginning stages of the Haitian Revolution, which will expel all white people from the island, and it really freaks out slave owners in the mainland United States who try to keep information about this quiet. But Napoleon is done with the American colonies, thinking that they're too expensive to govern and too much of a headache. He believes he's going to concentrate his efforts on Europe. So he turns to Thomas Jefferson and says, I've got this huge chunk of territory called the Louisiana Purchase. Would you care to make a deal? Now, Thomas Jefferson had been eyeing the Louisiana Territory for a while. We know that he would love to get his hands on it and establish his Empire of Liberty. He had sent a diplomat named Robert Livingston to Paris to discuss negotiations for use or purchase of the port of New Orleans, and he was prepared to offer $15 million for such a deal. Well, Napoleon turns to him and he says, well, how about the entire Louisiana territory for that $15 million you were offering? So Jefferson, realizing this is just too good of a deal to pass up, agrees, making this the famous Louisiana Purchase, the largest land grab in U.S. history. Well, here's Jefferson's problem. He's a strict constructionist, believing that neither the legislative nor the executive can take action unless the Constitution expressly gives them permission. And privately, he wrote just as much to a friend. He said, the general government has no powers, but such as the Constitution gives it. It has not given it the power of holding foreign territory, and still less incorporating it into the Union. An amendment of the Constitution seems necessary for this, but he knows that an amendment of the Constitution will take quite a while for all of the necessary states to debate and ratify that union, and then empower the president to do exactly what he wants to do, which is to purchase and hold foreign territory. What is a man to do? Well, those are Jefferson's well-known sentiments about strict constructionism. But he realizes that time is running out. Napoleon needs to dump this land somewhere, and it could go to one of the United States' less friendly counterparts out there. So publicly, he tells Congress, I want to buy the land, and the less we say about constitutional difficulties, the better. Of course, Congress gives him the money he needs, but then will not let this die. How's this for strict constructionism, Jefferson? Look what you've just done. Hello, here's that big government you sought to deny. Well, like a lot of early 19th century Americans, Thomas Jefferson has some really interesting ideas about what he's going to find in Louisiana Territory. First, he thinks that perhaps he may locate an all-water route across the continent. This is something that people have been looking for since the days of Christopher Columbus, is a navigable path through the American continent. It would be great to monopolize that path for trade. Another thing that he thinks he might run into is a dinosaur. This is not the silliest idea. This is a pre-Darwinian era. People have an understanding that dinosaurs have existed. People have known about their bones for some time, but this is a pre-Darwinian era. The idea of things going extinct is not yet part of everybody's general understanding. And so if we think that there are dinosaurs somewhere, they must still be dinosaurs today. If they existed once, they must exist today. Here's another idea that you might find a little bit outrageous. He thinks he might find Jews. Now, not modern-day Jews, but the descendants of the Israelites. The Bible tells of the 10 lost tribes of Israel going missing at some point, and there was a common belief in the 19th century that perhaps they migrated to the Americas. This idea is expressed later on in full force in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the Mormons, who hold to this belief today. Jefferson selected one man to lead the expedition, which is going to be called the Corps of Discovery. That man is Meriwether Lewis, and Meriwether Lewis very quickly turns to his friend as his co-captain, William Clark. The Corps of Discovery, led by Lewis and Clark, is 45 men, made up of rivermen, hunters, trappers, interpreters, and one cook. And also, there is an enslaved man named York, who is Clark's supposed property, who came along and accompanied them. Although he was never emancipated, not during, not after the Corps returned, he was nevertheless regarded as an equal, so it seems, on the expedition. He was a voting member of the Corps, having equal legislative authority, so it seems. The Mandan Indians, which is the first group that Lewis and Clark encountered in North Dakota, were so fascinated with York's dark skin that they tried to wipe off the paint by moistening their fingers and running them along his skin. Of course, no, it didn't happen. Well, Lewis and Clark are on a mission of science. They were charged with the collection of scientific data, which Lewis recorded in his journals. They were charged with the cataloging of trees, of flora and fauna, and Lewis and Clark both made extensive notes on these in their journals. They were also on a mission of imperialism. They were to inform the Indians that they encountered that the Great White Father, who lives in Washington, D.C., is now in charge, that their land has fallen into his domain, and they're going to have to get used to those ideas. And they were also told to identify possible locations for military bases. A native woman named Sacagawea, or you could say Sacagawea, there's no real consensus on how to say her name, aided as an interpreter and guide. And you can see below there, those are the peace medals with Thomas Jefferson's portrait on them that they were to give to the native people that they encountered, showing their peaceful intentions. So let's take just a minute to consider Sacagawea, the Shoshone woman that accompanied Lewis and Clark almost on the entire journey. She was an enslaved woman, actually. She was kidnapped by the Indian society known as the Mandan when she was about 10. And along with another woman that we don't know a lot about other than her name was Otter Woman, she was sold to a French fur trapper as a slave and a wife. And this is a non-consensual transaction, but not uncommon among the French and some of their Indian trading partners. Well, she joined the Corps of Discovery when Lewis and Clark approached her husband, Toussaint Charbonneau, to act as a translator in the spring of 1804, where they were making camp at that Mandan village before they really set off into the unknown. And so Sacagawea was 16 when she joined, and if she was not pregnant at the time, she became pregnant very soon afterwards and gave birth to a son on the expedition that they named Jean-Baptiste, or John the Baptist. And the presence of a child along the way helped to maybe solidify the idea in other natives' minds that they were on a peaceful mission, because war parties very rarely, bring the kids along, and so this probably helped them quite a bit. The other thing that helped them a lot was Sacagawea's extensive knowledge of the terrain and the people that inhabit it. She located edible foods, navigable rivers, and communicated among the native people, probably saving their necks more than once. Lewis and Clark were also on a mission of commerce. They were charged with negotiating fur agreements with the native peoples that they encountered. They were charged with identifying rivers as possible trade routes. And of course, all of this is going to need money. Thomas Jefferson quietly asked Congress to bankroll the expedition. Quietly, because he did not want his Federalist opponents to know that he was asking for more money. He asked for the appropriation of $2,500 for the purpose of extending the external commerce of the United States. All of this, we have to remember, were being requested by a man who didn't like commerce, who thought that the future of the nation was in farming. Well, nevertheless, this is what he's asking for. And here's another irony. Hamilton's Bank is going to be the institution that's going to lend Jefferson's expedition the funds. And also, first and foremost, Lewis and Clark are on a mission of exploration. They are to establish an American presence in the West and let the competing nations know, such as England, such as France, such as Russia, let them realize that the Americans are going to take possession of this territory and they are going to exercise sovereignty. They're out there to see what is there. And so here you have the Lewis and Clark expedition starting off at St. Louis and ending up at the Pacific. They traveled a little bit beyond what the purchase actually specified, but the purpose of the expedition was to chart a path all the way to the Pacific, which they did. We're going to turn our attention now to a part of Thomas Jefferson's life that he would probably prefer remained buried somewhere, and that is to address the question, did Thomas Jefferson have an illicit affair with an enslaved woman, his enslaved woman named Sally Hemings? Well, the first accusation was actually made in 1802 by an angry and denied office seeker whose name was James Callender, who published the idea that published the suggestion that Jefferson was having a sexual affair with an enslaved woman, and her name is Sally, he writes. Now, Jefferson responded to the accusation with silence, and he never did say anything about it. And from a political standpoint, I think that's probably a wise thing to do. I mean, people tend to get themselves in a lot of trouble by just running their mouths off, and if people just would learn to not say as much, I think they'd be in a better position. Well, this is what Jefferson did. He responded with silence. Now, the sexual abuse of enslaved people was, unfortunately, common in the antebellum South, but this does not mean that it was publicly talked about or publicly condoned. So to say this about Thomas Jefferson is to say things that is happening among a lot of white men and enslaved women, but still not something you bring up in polite company and still qualifies as a scandal. Well, the story was very quickly picked up by the Federalist press, who are very anxious to smear Jefferson's good name. And they're not anti-slavery. They were anti-Jefferson. And so anything that's going to tarnish his name, they're going to publish. And it did, in fact, cost him votes during the re-election campaign of 1804, but nevertheless, Thomas Jefferson was re-elected to a second term. The Jefferson family did speak out, and later on into really the 1980s, they said that the accusation was absurd, and they never did acknowledge it. Sally Hemings, unfortunately, as an enslaved woman, left no records for us to look over. In the 19th century, later 19th century, abolitionists circulated and embellished the story, adding to it and exaggerating to it, and their idea here was to showcase this as an instance and proof of slavery's evils. A number of illegitimate children, they were exaggerated, the lascivious accounts were expanded. This is not to say that Jefferson is off the hook here, but they certainly did sensationalize the story quite a bit in order to smear Jefferson's name. Well, did Jefferson do it? It's a question that has occupied historians and scholars for quite a while. The Jefferson family has always denied it, saying no. And there was never enough evidence to say otherwise. That is until 1998, when researchers began to look into DNA. And the DNA evidence points directly at Jefferson. What researchers found is that the Jefferson Y chromosome is genetically identical to that found in the Hemings male descendants, giving us about a 99.9% certainty that there is some genetic mixing going on between the Jefferson family and the Hemings family. Now, of all of the male relatives living at the time of the Hemings, very few actually visited Monticello, meaning that the researchers can say with pretty much certainty the simplest and most probable conclusion was that Thomas Jefferson had fathered Hemings 6 children. Well, since knowledge of the affair has become public knowledge, the affair has been celebrated and romanticized by a number of folks. So you're looking at a picture on the right there of one of these made-for-TV movies by, I don't know, like Hallmark or Lifetime or one of these, which romanticizes, idealizes, and celebrates the relationship between Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. The historian Fawn Brodie, who wrote in the 1970s, concluded that the two lived in a private happiness away from the strictures and condemnations of 19th century Virginia, not letting anybody know what they were up to. Well, certainly if that's true, they did not let anybody know what they were up to. There is some grounds for making this assertion. First, the affair took place after Jefferson's wife had died. Secondly, he never formally remarried anybody. And thirdly, was apparently monogamous to Sally Hemings throughout his entire life. So if this is an exploitative relationship, this is exclusively exploitative. He did not seem to go anywhere else. At least we do not have the evidence that he did. But on the other side of this, the affair has been condemned. Critics will say that an enslaved black woman of the early 19th century cannot give her consent to this relationship. And so no matter how we characterize it in modern terms, we cannot escape the fact that she was enslaved and being denied any actual social or political power. And so how can we say these things? Jefferson, after all, was in a position of power, and that made genuine companionship impossible, so say the critics. So, wherever you land on this issue is, of course, up to you. And one of the questions that we have to concern ourselves with is, why didn't he free her or her children? If this was a relationship based on mutual love and respect, why not emancipate those that you love rather than keeping them in bondage? Here's one response, and this comes from the historian Douglas Wilson, who points out that 19th century Virginia was just not a welcoming place for free black people. In fact, 1806 law required that free black people leave Virginia within a year. So if he did emancipate her, she would have a very difficult life, finding employment, finding livelihood, finding food for her children. Well, upon his death, 5 enslaved people were freed, but they did not include Sally. So what are we left with? We are left with a monogamous relationship that lasted almost 4 decades and which resulted in 6 children. And I just want to leave you with one point of view which you may agree with or disagree with, and this is from one of the primary historians who have looked into the Jefferson-Hemings scenario here, and her name is Annette Gordon Reed. She wrote the book The Hemings of Monticello, An American Family. She writes, "Love has been many things throughout history. The simple comfort of the familiar, having a person to know and being known by that person in return, a connection born of shared experiences, an irrational joy in another's presence, a particular calming influence that one member of the couple may exert on the other, or that they both provide to one another. A combination of all these and myriad other things can go into making one person wish to stay tied to another. Anyone who is not in the couple, that is, everyone else in the world, will not understand precisely how or why it works for 2 people." Jefferson is going to have to deal with the same problem that Washington had to deal with and Adams had to deal with. That's the problem in foreign affairs, namely, how are we going to remain neutral in the Napoleonic Wars between England and France? France is continuing to seize American ships, seize their cargo, and harass American ships, not recognizing neutrality. England continues to also seize American ships and to impress American sailors into service in the Royal Navy. This is a particular problem because this is a drain on American resources and manpower, and also Americans are not permitted to freely conduct commerce on the high seas. Now, of the 2, England and France, England is being particularly difficult. There is the problem of impressment, or the kidnapping of American sailors and impressing them into service into the Royal Navy. Also, there's problems on the continent. England will not abandon its forts in the Northwest Territory. This is something they had promised to do under the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which concluded the Revolutionary War, and they also promised to do it in Jay's Treaty of 1794, and they're still not living up to their promises. And then there's another issue. It seems that the British are arming American Indians on the frontier with weapons and inciting them to violence against American settlements. So not only are they not abandoning their forts in the Northwest Territory, they are also enlisting Indians to wage a war against Americans on the frontier. These things make England particularly difficult to deal with. In 1807, Jefferson is going to have to deal with an international incident that is known as the Chesapeake Affair. The British warship the Leopard fired on an American ship, the Chesapeake, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. So this is well within American waters. It killed 3 soldiers, wounded 18, and then the British impressed 4 American sailors into service and executed 1. Thomas Jefferson replies, "On this outrage, no commentaries are necessary. Its character has been pronounced by the indignant voices of our citizens with an emphasis and unanimity never exceeded." Well, 9,000 American sailors were impressed by the British before the outbreak of the War of 1812. So this is no small annoyance. This is the kidnapping of Americans on a large scale. What is Jefferson supposed to do? If he makes peace with the British, then he provokes the French. If he makes peace with the French, then he just provokes the British. Well, his decision is a little bit controversial. It's called the Embargo Act of 1807, in which he basically says, I'm not trading with anybody. He orders all British ships out of American ports, and he prohibits American ships from trading with either Britain or France. He's trying to establish the economic importance of the United States, trying to show the European nations that they cannot do without American trade and that they'd better start behaving. And what this actually does is it has the adverse effect on American economic activity. If you look at my graph to the left there, you can see that starting in 1807, the value of imports and exports just drops, and by 1808 it's dropping to nothing. American trade revenue drops 75% in 1808 and 1809, making New England shippers particularly angry. Here's a cartoon that dramatizes Jefferson's Embargo Act. You have a turtle biting one guy's butt, and he's screaming out in pain. He says, "Oh, this cursed, oh grab me." And oh grab me is embargo spelled backwards. In 1808, Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act. This was Jefferson's last act in office before he's going to vacate the executive mansion, and this restricts the embargo only to Britain and France, meaning that we will trade freely with almost anybody else. It is a major fail because, of course, the 2 big trading partners that we need to have commerce with are Britain and France. And so in 1808, James Madison, who is Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, the father of the Constitution, continuing the Virginia dynasty, all of these things, he wins a presidential election over the Federalist DeWitt Clinton, who's governor of New York. Now, of course, he inherits this foreign relations problem that Jefferson had to deal with, Adams and Washington had to deal with, and of course, a terrible economy thanks to the Embargo Act of 1807. So he then tries to modify this without backtracking, without reversing the decisions of his predecessor. He passes what's called Macon's Bill number 2, which is like an amendment bill on the Embargo Act. It says this: the U.S. will resume normal trade against whoever respects American neutrality first. So whether that be Britain or France. So, hey, you want free and unencumbered trade with the United States, then just respect our neutrality. Now, this is really pretty shrewd because it puts it on the belligerent powers to make the first move. You respect our neutrality, and it will benefit you economically, because then we will not be trading with the other partner. It's France that makes the deal first. France comes out and says, I will respect your neutrality. Now let's talk. So normal trade relationships resume with France. Well, let's now consider how the American Indians are figuring into this geopolitical crisis between the United States and the belligerent powers of Europe. Under Thomas Jefferson, the U.S. had pursued a double approach to Indian policy that would be either extermination or assimilation. Become a white American and try to participate in white American politics and culture, or die. Of course, most Indians rejected either option, and a lot turned to two Shawnee brothers named Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, and formed what was called the Western Confederacy. Now, the Western Confederacy was actually formed after the Revolutionary War in order to resist U.S. expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And so this is a reboot of that organization. It's a revitalization of it. It's a pan-Indian movement, meaning that lots of different Indian groups, regardless of tribe or language, are invited to join on the condition that you reject white ways, white government, certainly white hegemony, white religion, and alcohol. But that does not seem to extend to white guns. So, as we had noted before, the British have been refusing to abandon their forts in the Northwest Territory. They were supposed to do this under the Treaty of Paris in 1783. They again promised to do it in the Jay's Treaty of 1794, and they're still not doing it. And we see that Indian attacks are on the rise with increasing frequency. More and more Indians are attacking American settlements as they're trying to move west. And so the belief is that the British are arming the Indians, making deals, and so the Indians are using British arms in their attacks on American settlements. Madison's suspicion is confirmed at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. That's when General William Henry Harrison raids what is known as Prophetstown near Indiana and scores a major victory over the Indians, and it's a victory for the whites, and there it is discovered, we have proof, we have the smoking gun of British interference. British guns are found among the Indians, therefore confirming that the British have been selling or giving the Indians their weapons, which they have been using to conduct their raids against American settlements in the West. Here is a political cartoon that dramatizes what the Americans believe are happening here, and I've written the text above there so you can see it. There you have an Indian who's bringing an American scalp to a British commander. He says, "Bring me the scalp and our king, your master, will reward you." And then there's a sign on the Indian's gun that he's carrying around, and it says, "Reward for 16 scalps." Well, this discovery of British guns at the Battle of Tippecanoe is the straw that breaks the camel's back for a lot of people, but certainly not everyone. But one Tennessee congressman raises a point. He says, look, before we go to war, we really have to consider something. His name is Felix Grundy, the Tennessee congressman. He says this. He says, the true question and controversy involves the interest of the whole nation. This war, if carried on successfully, will have its advantages. We shall drive the British from our continent. He says, if we go to war with the British and we win, then yes, we will benefit from that. The British will be gone. But I want you to pay attention to what he says next. I am willing to receive the Canadians, that is the people populating the northern territories. I am willing to receive them as adopted brethren. It will have beneficial political effects. It will preserve the equilibrium of the government. Read that again. it will preserve the equilibrium of the government. When Louisiana shall be fully peopled, the northern states will lose their power. They will be at the discretion of others. They can be depressed at pleasure, and then this union might be endangered. I therefore feel anxious not only to add the Floridas to the south, but the Canadas to the north of this empire. Look at this language. By adding Canada, if we win against the British, it will preserve the equilibrium of government, because you see, we are talking about the population of the Louisiana Territory, and Felix Grundy says a lot of this will go into the southern political orbit and therefore cost the Northerners political power. But if we can add Canada, then that will give the Northerners political power. I think this is interesting because you see the bat squeak of sectionalism really begin to be heard here in the War of 1812. President Madison asks Congress for a declaration of war on June 1st, 1812. The reasons are easy to identify. The impressment of American sailors on the high seas and the seizure of American ships and cargo, the refusal to acknowledge American neutrality in the Napoleonic Wars, and the most recent development, the arming of Indians on the frontier and the refusal of the British to abandon their forts in the Northwest Territory. If we win, says the Madison administration, there could be land for us in Canada. There could be the addition of new lands to the American empire of liberty. Not everybody really likes the idea, though. Congress debates this war proposition for 2 weeks. You see, the country is seriously divided between New England, that hates the idea of war with Old England, and you have the Warhawks in the West and the South that thinks this is a great idea. I want you to take a really good look at how the nation is divided by this war. You've got the Federalists and the Republicans breakdown to your right. Look at how many Federalists are voting for the war. None. Not a single Federalist voted for the war. All Federalists, all 40 of them, voted against the war. The Republicans, on the other hand, 98 yay, 22 no. So this is a breakdown. It's not just by party, it's regionally as well. Not a single Federalist voted for it. New England and much of the North is opposed, whereas the West and the South are in favor. Why is this? It's because the West and the South, they're the ones that want to deal with a lot of the so-called Indian problems. And New England, they're the ones whose lifeblood is maritime trade with Europe. They would stand to lose a lot if the United States went to war with England. Well, we should ask, is the United States ready for war? Thomas Jefferson believes that this will be a mere matter of marching. But when you take a look at how the United States stacks up against Europe, we are in a sad position. We have a very small army. Remember, Thomas Jefferson reduced the standing army to 2,500 guys? We have no navy because Thomas Jefferson halted the construction of John Adams' Navy, and all we can boast of is the Mosquito fleet. We also have no system of finance because the Republicans and Thomas Jefferson are skeptical of the growth of the commercial system, and so they halted that whenever they could. So we're not really prepared. Why does James Madison think we can win this? He believes that England is so busy fighting Napoleon in Europe that he will not care about what would be a little sideshow in Canada. Well, he was wrong. The Canadian front is a disaster for the Americans. England proves more than willing to stand their ground against the invading Americans and fight to the death to defend their territory. There are more losses than wins, and the British continue to dominate the Great Lakes. And then, just as we thought things could not get worse for the Americans, surprise! England wins in Europe and sends Napoleon into exile. What this means is that now you have 10,000 British troops that are free for combat and ready for combat in America. So the British invade the Chesapeake. They burn Washington, D.C., forcing James Madison and his cabinet to flee. Did Dolly Madison save the portrait of George Washington from burning? So here's a little bit of a side story. The women of Washington often acted as ambassadors of their husbands' political ambitions. It was really common for the wives of politicians to go to and hold really big social functions that greased the wheels of state. They would call on one another. This means they would visit one another in a formal way, in a custom that elites thought solidified their political relationships and helped them out in the long run. Dolly Madison perfected the presidential party. She was known as the Presidentress for her overt political maneuvering and her use of social functions to get what she wanted or what she believed would be beneficial for her husband. And this is actually kind of ironic because James Madison was a very quiet, introverted, bookish man who didn't like to go to parties, but his wife, well, she'd throw him on his behalf. They were called Mrs. Madison's Crush, or The Squeeze. I don't know how they got that name. And these were the events to which an aspiring man of state hoped he would receive an invitation. Mrs. Madison held these weekly squeezes for the chosen ones of Washington society. They were these really big, long, elegant affairs that would last for hours into the night. And it was an event essential to political networking, to gossiping, to gathering information, and to courting patronage with people that you wanted to suck up to. She tried, according to an observer, to destroy rancorous feelings then so bitter between Federalists and Republicans. Well, nevertheless, it was exactly this sort of political elitism that Andrew Jackson could not stand when he instituted his rotation in office policy, otherwise known as the spoils system, in 1828. I would call this sort of a 19th century version of drain the swamp, if you will. Well, didn't Dolly Madison rescue the portrait of George Washington from burning when the British invaded the Chesapeake? That's the story that at least I was told in elementary school. Is it true? It's not really true. It's true to an extent. What she did was she ordered an enslaved man, Paul Jennings, to enter the burning White House and save the portrait. And Paul Jennings was so worried because the portrait was actually bolted to the wall that he had to crack the frame in order to get it out, and he was worried that he would be punished for that. Paul, later on, he was a literate man, and wrote in his memoirs that he and a French cook did the physical labor while Dolly Madison looked on from safety. So, we can kind of add the rest of that story, right? With the success of the Chesapeake invasion, the British tried again, this time at Fort McHenry in Maryland. But unlike in Virginia, the Americans successfully defended the fort and kept the British from making landfall. One of the interesting side stories to this war is during the Battle of Fort McHenry, the U.S. diplomat, a guy named Francis Scott Key, was being held aboard a British ship. And all through the night, he was inspired by the sight of the American flag continually waving throughout the bombardment. And he would catch sight of it every time a bomb would go off and the flare would light the night sky. He could see that the flag had yet not been lowered, which meant that the Americans had not yet surrendered. He was so inspired that he wrote some lyrics and then put them to music in 1814, and it was called The Defense of Fort McHenry, and it became the national anthem of the United States during the Great Depression in 1931. Well, the national anthem, with which we're probably all familiar, has a bit of a troublesome history. There was an infamous third verse that was dropped in 1931 and edited right out of the original, but recent critics have called attention to it. Here's what it says. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country shall leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their vile footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hiring and the slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. What are we supposed to do with these lines? These lines that so clearly support the institution of slavery and threaten violence and death against the hireling and the slave, or people who would try to seek freedom. Should we overlook these verses? Should we rewrite these verses? Should we get rid of the entire national anthem altogether? Scott's own views on white supremacy cannot be denied. He says to a group of anti-abolitionists in 1836, "Are you willing, gentlemen, to abandon your country, to permit it to be taken from you and occupied by the abolitionist according to whose taste it is to associate and amalgamate with the Negro? Or, gentlemen, on the other hand, are there laws in this community to defend you from the immediate abolitionist, who would open upon you the floodgates of such extensive wickedness and mischief?" So what should we do with this? What are the options? There are a couple that have been thrown out there by people who have strong feelings on both sides. One, we could ignore it and continue to sing the national anthem as we always have and simply pretend like this history never happened. We could throw it out and write a new national anthem, one that embodies our current views and ideas and values. Or we could continue to sing the edited version. Well, my own views, and feel free to disagree here, is that we should acknowledge the ugly part, and we should keep it as part of our history, like we should acknowledge Confederate flags or concentration camps to the Germans, but do not celebrate these parts or pretend that they are still part of our national value system, because clearly they're not. I ask myself this: is America not a work in progress? Do we not amend the Constitution and keep working to form a more perfect union? The Constitution, after all, was written originally in support of slavery. But we have edited that part out. It was called the 13th Amendment, and I think we kept on trying to remedy that problem with the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, and then we've continued by adding civil rights acts throughout history. Now we have to acknowledge these parts of our history, even if we do not celebrate them. So, for my own view, I'm going to keep on singing the national anthem, and I'm going to recognize that part of the beauty of the national anthem is that we do edit it, just like we continually edit what it means to be an American. Not ignore, not revise, not hide anything, but we have to acknowledge that being an American and the American proposition is a work in progress, and we've been working on it for quite a while. Well, back to New England. Because no New England Federalists had voted for the war, they felt like they were coerced into supporting it. A lot of Republicans began to question their patriotism and their loyalty. And the rumor started that the so-called blue light Federalists, or people who stood on the docks or on the rocky shores holding a blue lantern to help guide enemy ships along, that proliferated, although it probably wasn't true. What is true, though, is that in 1814, 5 delegates from the New England states met secretly in Hartford, Connecticut. They drafted a series of demands to present to Congress. They want compensation for money lost from trade during the war. They want abolition of the 3/5 compromise, which gives Southern states an edge in voting. They want a 2/3 majority vote to be necessary in order to declare war. And they want a constitutional amendment limiting the president to 1 term and prohibiting presidents from sharing a state. So in other words, you can't elect a guy from Virginia and then the next guy being from Virginia. And what if our demands are not met, say the delegates from New England? Well, if we don't get what we want, they even toy with the idea of secession from the Union, separating from the United States and forming their own republic. Well, the Hartford Convention comes to nothing because in January of 1815, General Andrew Jackson from Tennessee repelled a major British assault in New Orleans in Louisiana. This prevents the British from seizing both the Mississippi River and the entirety of the Louisiana Territory. One soldier recalled, "The general drew up his figure, bowed with disease and weakness to its full height, and with an eye of fire and an emphatic blow upon the table, with his clenched fist, exclaimed, "By the Eternal, they shall not sleep on our soil." And so the Battle of New Orleans was the most spectacular victory of the entirety of the War of 1812. The Battle of New Orleans turned out to be insignificant when it came to actually determining the course of the war, because, unknown to everybody, the Treaty of Ghent was signed 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans in Belgium. It was really a ceasefire. None of the things that the United States went to war in order to gain came into reality. There was no mention of impressment. There was no mention of arming the Indians on the frontier. There was certainly no lands to be awarded in Canada. And in fact, the one phrase that everybody remembers from the Treaty of Ghent is that it calls for the restoration of antebellum status quo, which means we're just going to go back to the way things were before the war.